Hi, good morning. So great to see all of you bright and early this morning. Thank you so much for coming. This is our Women and Allies in RCC, and we are so delighted to have a really great program for you guys this morning. It's a little bit more than we've done in the past, so it's certainly, we still want it to be interactive toward the end of the session, and so I hope you guys all get a lot out of this. We have Dr. Olga Bashampayan, who will come up and introduce our guest speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Tian. Good morning, everyone. And I am just so humbled and honored by this support you guys have shown. So if so many people can be there at 6:30 in the morning, then anything is possible. But next time we will try and make it at a more decent time. Especially for Gretchen's sake. She's already complained more. Okay. But anyway, so I'm really excited how this is coming along and to have this speaker. You know, interestingly, I was talking to one of my friends who is a women in entrepreneur. She's not in the medical field, but she's an entrepreneur in engineering and IT. But she is part of this Harvard Women Entrepreneurs group, and she suggested Hannah, who had spoken to their group, and she had just loved the different things she had to share in terms of negotiation and women by gender, how much we get, you know, how those are big obstacles for us, and you know, maybe we don't do as well as our male counterparts, and there is definitely data that shows that in general compensation is less for women than men. I mean, that's across the board. National figures have consistently shown that over and over. So and it's not just money. Sometimes it's, you know, position, promotion. There are multiple stages of negotiation, starting with your first job to what you're doing and what you would like to do within your different fields. So that is what Hannah is going to talk to us about. Definitely want to keep it interactive, and we should have enough time for Q&A and sort of to welcome your comments. So Hannah Riley Bowles is a senior lecturer in public policy and management at the Harvard Kennedy School of Business, where she chairs the Management, Leadership, and Decision Sciences area. She co-directs the Center for Public Leadership and Women and Public Policy program. She directs two executive programs, Women in Power and Women Leading Change. She's a leading expert on gender negotiation. Her research obviously focuses on women's leadership advancement and the role of negotiation in educational and career advancement, including the management of work-family conflict. She has always been actively involved in negotiation and conflict management, and she has actually, through her career, worked for the governments of Argentina, Costa Rica, and Germany. So obviously that shows her global presence. And you know, she went to school at Harvard and is trained there and has her undergrad from Smith College. So she will actually be also sharing some resources afterwards with a QR code, as well as we'll be able to put some of those resources on our website so you have some continued interaction with this topic. So thank you, Hannah, for doing this. Hannah Riley Bowles.
So thank you for having me, and I was very happy, I was excited to accept this invitation, honored to be asked, but also I get to, because I'm based in the Boston area, pretty regularly have conversations with women in science and women in the medical science in particular, and they've always been such rich experiences for me, so I'm delighted to be here. What I want to do is I'm going to aim toward this resource, this workbook that we'll make available to you. It has 4 simple steps, but what I've found is that those 4 steps make more sense if you can understand the research behind them. So what I want to do is give you a bit of the background of the research, the kind of latest evidence on gender and negotiation, I will be talking in the course of that about the leadership and negotiation. I will argue leadership is in effect a negotiation because what you're asking people to do is to go for what you're proposing as compared to some alternative. And so it's fundamentally the same analytics and a lot of the same persuasion skills. So this is a really, negotiation is just this basic micro mechanism of human engagement, but it is also a really important mechanism for the distribution of resources and opportunities, and so has meaningful implications for career advancement and for inequality in career advancement. So I'm going to talk, as I've just said, in the first part about where biases might lurk in negotiation context, and then introduce this Be Sure negotiation preparation framework. So the objectives are to illuminate contextual factors that heighten the potential for inequality or inequitable outcomes in negotiation. The second is to think about career negotiations. What do I mean by that? And then third, this preparatory framework that you'll again get access to. You can either, I'll give you the QR code or you'll get it in an email, I think. So this is the 4 steps. But let me go to the research first and then we'll get there. Okay, if you remember only one thing from this talk, please remember that the gender of a person is just not a reliable predictor of behavior in negotiation. If I just bring men and women into the lab, or if I go out and I watch them in organizations, they will not reliably behave differently enough for me to publish a study, right? But a lot of us, me included, have published a lot of studies on gender and negotiation showing significant effects. But how we do that is we understand what are the contextual factors that heighten the potential for reliable gender effects, right? So what we really need to do is be aware of the situational conditions that heighten the potential for gender effects. And actually, I'm just wrapping up a review with a couple of co-authors showing that a lot of the patterns that I'm going to talk about with regard to negotiation also tend to apply to other effects related to leadership and to risk-taking in terms of gender differences. So I'm going to use the example of pay negotiations, which is the one we kind of always talk about. But that we always talk about this because we want to publish our studies, and so we go back to pay negotiations, right? We want to get gender effects, we're going to run a pay negotiation study. And I'm going to talk to you about why that is a particularly rife domain for getting gender effects, whereas we don't get them in other places. So this is what, when you think about context, I'd like you to think about these 2 basic categories of factors that influence the potential for gender effects in negotiation. So basically what we're going to argue is that gender effects, the darkness, more dark is more likely here. So when gender is more salient within the context, more relevant and salient, it's something, we're in a domain that is associated, say, with this is a guy's job, or, you know, men or women have typically dominated that space. Those would be situations that heighten the sort of relevance and salience of gender. By the way, I'm going to talk in largely binary terms. That is a reflection of the literature. The literature is just starting to get into kind of broader, be more inclusive of gender minorities, and I'm very happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I don't have enough research to speak responsibly on that topic. Now, the other condition, the contextual factor that heightens the potential for these gender effects is ambiguity, right? So, actually, I'll use the example of leadership again, but this has kind of always been a guy's job, right? Or this is like typically a man's job. And we don't really know, we don't have a very clear description of how it is performed, right? So if I'm not exactly sure what I need from the role, and I've got a type in my head of who should play that role, then I'm likely, you know, consciously or unconsciously to tap someone who fits in the stereotype of who's good at that role, right? If I have, so I'm going to go here and then I'll go back to ambiguity, but pay negotiations are an example of this. Okay, so it's really well documented that people tend to associate negotiating for higher pay more with men than with women. Stereotypes are a reflection of society. If you look around society, men tend to dominate the highest paid positions. They tend to dominate the positions of highest authority that have kind of control over those resources. Pay is a status-linked resource. It's just, in study after study, they've just shown it's a very masculine stereotype domain. The other thing about pay negotiations, and I'm going to talk particularly in a Western individualist culture, is that they're perceived as competitive. So not only over this status-linked resource that tends to be associated with men, but it's typically perceived as a competitive enterprise. And in Western cultures, men are more stereotyped as competitive, individualistic, forward-leaning, and women are idealized as people who put others before themselves, right? So it's just this counter-stereotypical space. It's a space where we can just, where just like kind of we get all of our pinch points together, particularly when there's a high degree of ambiguity. And so what we find is that women are less likely to assert themselves in pay negotiations based on a variety of measures. But they're also, but the best explanation for why is that they encounter more resistance than men do in that space. So they're more likely to get resistance to their attempts. There's some evidence, although mixed now, it's sort of norms seem to be changing, of social backlash. Yeah, sure, I'll give her that money, but I don't really want to work with her, you know. And so it's actually, if women are more hesitant to enter into this space, it's rational, it's reasonable, because they're reading that this is a more socially complex, maybe risky space for me than it is for a guy, right? But again, in domains that aren't stereotyped in the same way, you don't get the same effects, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And also, if I can reduce ambiguity, if we know what the norms are with regard to compensation, if we understand what the norms are with regard to how these conversations are managed, the effects go away, okay? And the effects go away in terms of the propensity to lean in and to negotiate. The effects go away with regard to how much people ask for, because people are focused on the norms within the situation, right? This is actually very important for thinking about, my understanding, I'm not, again, expert in this domain, I just have all these wonderful conversations with people who are. But there are a lot of, my understanding is that there are actually, if we just focus on compensation, which I'm going to encourage us in a minute not to do, but that there are kind of multiple dimensions potentially of compensation within the medical sciences, and there may be a lot of ambiguity about exactly how all these packages are constructed. So it's worth kind of thinking about, does everybody understand clearly what the norms are, how these things are figured out, how one approaches these things? Okay. So if I get into a space where the norms are clear, gender is not particularly salient, I'm not going to run a study in that white box because I'm not going to get any effects. I'm just wasting my money, right? And a lot of the world, maybe hopefully increasingly, a lot of the world falls into that white box, but a lot of the world still also falls into the darker gray spaces. Okay. So what I want to talk about first, or unpack a little bit more of this relevance and salience dimension. So another thing that you have to take into account is how is gender socially constructed, right? So as I was mentioning, in Western cultures, back up one more. What the latest research from psychology, cross-cultural psychology, shows is that stereotypes of men tend to be aligned with cultural ideals. So in very individualistic cultures, like in the US, a lot of Western Europe, we prize individualism, self-assertion, competitiveness, and those are the stereotypes that are associated with men. In collectivist cultures, which I kind of represent this by the individualists over here, they're filling their own bowls, right? The collectivists are focused on filling the collective bowl, right? They're focused on they're prioritizing service for the group, right? And they may be very competitive with regard to outsiders from the group, but their focus is putting the group ahead of the self is the ideal. So in places like East Asia or a Turkey or maybe even a Venezuela, well, Venezuela's in such disarray right now, but think of like a place like China, where a lot of this, actually some of the research that's being led here is a Chinese scholar. The stereotype of men is that they are focused on the collective and not on the self, and that women are individualistically competitive. And so when you run studies of who is the, what is the stereotype of who is the better competitive negotiator, in a place like the US, people assume men are the better competitive negotiators. If you go and collect that data in China, people would say women are the better competitive negotiators. And when you actually look at, there's a recent meta-analysis where they looked at gender differences and the outcomes of competitive negotiation as they vary depending on the collectivism or individualism of the culture. And over on the individualistic side, men are showing better outcomes, and on the collectivist side, women are showing better outcomes. So again, this is real. I mean, this is just like you look at these data and you're like, no, it's not the gender of a person that's predicting things. It's the social context. It's the environment. It's our assumptions about types, right? Okay. So the other thing to think about here is also intersecting identities, because, you know, gender isn't always the most salient thing when you interact with somebody. So I'm sure as many of you have experienced actually over the course of your careers, that as you rise in status, right, and reputation, people are engaging with you as a senior professional, as an expert in a particular domain, as somebody occupying a particular role. Achieved status characteristics can kind of overwhelm the influence of people making gender associations. Not always, but you're more likely, again, if I'm going to run a study in a lab and I want to use my money well and I want to get an effect, I'm going to choose as my target, or what they're analyzing, a more junior woman whose expertise is like good, but like a little bit more ambiguous, because people are much more likely to use stereotypes against her than they are if I say this is a super high achieving professional executive. They may focus more on the high achievement characteristics and less on the gender, right? There's other things, going back to like the cultural characteristics, there's stuff that goes on, if you look at the research about gender and race in the United States, one of the things that really upsets me also about overgeneralizing about gender and negotiation is that it's really, I mean, not to get too I'll sound like liberal elite, but it's very it's actually patriarchy is the issue. Patriarchy by basically meaning it's really the dominant male group. It's not men. So for instance, within the United States, black men, as compared to white men, run into a lot of the same resistance that we've documented for women as compared to men. Asian men are stereotyped as being more feminine, more collectivist, and they encounter more resistance than women do to their attempts to self-assert, either in terms of negotiation or leadership. And so what's actually really important is we have to think about not only gender, but we have to think about kind of what are the dominance hierarchies within a cultural context. And it's really a lot of these gender things about what are the privileges of the dominant group as opposed to those who might be less privileged within the context. And we expect folks from the dominant group to maybe self-assert or make decisions or step forward. And then those folks who aren't from the dominant group sometimes run into more resistance because we're not expecting them to make claim to these things that they haven't received traditionally in the past. And again, we may not do this fully consciously. The other thing is that, so like with the data on individualism versus collectivism, you see in some of the data around race in the US with black women being expected to be more assertive than black men because black women are perceived to have higher status within our society than are black men. And in some respects, actually, we even expect black women to be more assertive negotiators, to be more assertive leaders than white women because of these stereotypes. Similarly, if you flip it around and you say somebody is homosexual, you assume that we make these stereotypes that if a person is attracted to men, that they're feminine. These are very heteronormative assumptions that don't carry. But if you make an assumption, if a person's attracted to men, they must be feminine. And if a person is attracted to women, they must be masculine. And therefore, we assume that lesbian women are assertive negotiators within the US, and we assume gay men are going to be less assertive. I mean, it's just fascinating, right? So again, it doesn't belong to the individual. You have to kind of think about what are the salient assumptions within this environment that may be influencing expectations that people have about who should be negotiating, how they should be negotiating, access to what types of resources they should have. So then the other factor is like organizational culture and demography. So if you're in a space that is dominated by one type, and again, it doesn't need to be gender. So if you look at like, I've also done some stuff on people from emerging economies working in global work environments. You know, there's just the dominant group are the folks from the US and Europe in these global corporations, and there are different assumptions about how folks from emerging economies should behave. But if you're not in the dominant group, that makes your identity more salient. You know, you might stick out. If everybody's mixed up and all from different kind of categories, then your distinctive category just doesn't stand out because everybody's something else, right? Or if there's lots of men and women, being a woman doesn't really stand out. If you're one of the very few women, people may kind of think that being a woman, or like, it's just more salient. They may be more likely to think about it. And I'm going to come back to the implications also of these types of organizational environments for the ambiguity issue. Okay, and then the subject of negotiation. So I've already mentioned that pay is this very masculine, stereotyped domain. We've just demonstrated this across a lot of different domains. Now, negotiating for flexibility is very feminine stereotyped. Right? So actually, if we had started our research on gender and negotiation, not just running study after study about pay, but if we were running study after study about negotiating for work flexibility, you know, the first big book would have been Men Don't Negotiate, not Women Don't Negotiate. It's just really hard for people to do what is counter-stereotypical. And this has really actually very meaningful implications, kind of broader implications. I'll just talk about this quickly for work, family, and its implications for career advancement. But you know, if you have this young egalitarian couple who comes out, you know, and they're saying, oh, we're going to support each other in our careers, and we both want to be involved in the family, and then one of them finds it a lot easier to get access to flexible opportunities, or their work environment is looking at them, expecting them to slow down for a few years, and the other one, and they have a little more trouble kind of self-asserting around pay or promotions or things, and then the other one is finding the work environment discouraging of them, never imagining that they would slow down, and if anything, encouraging them to be, you know, pursuing more resources. You can end up with a couple that intended to be sharing things in a way, like after your first kid, certainly your second kid, you're in a much more traditional relationship than you originally imagined. And so there is this interface, and I've got another stream of work on engaged fatherhood. I can come back and talk about that, but you can't, you know, there's no pursuit of gender equality by just adding paid labor on top of unpaid labor for women. We need to be thinking about paid and unpaid labor and how we think about the gender distribution of both. Role negotiations. What is the type of contributions? What are the types of contributions that I want to make at work? How do I think we should change the way we do things around here? Those are not really gendered. We're not really finding evidence of backlash or resistance or assumptions. So particularly if you have expertise. So this is actually when we interview mid-career and senior executives and professionals about what they negotiate mostly at work, it's about their role. It's about the work that they do. Very rare that they're negotiating their pay, really exceptional, and because it's only just certain moments in life typically. And also, only during certain periods of life do you have the work-life types of stuff that you're negotiating. The role is and that stuff is not gendered. So this is a space where the less shaded or white area is much, much larger. One other thing to highlight here that really bothers me about the overemphasis on pay in the gender negotiation discussion, and because people link it to the gender pay gap, and they say, oh, look at this, look at like women are making 81 cents on the dollar, and then there's gender differences in negotiation. Number one, the proportion of that like missing link that's associated with negotiation is small. It's really mostly about the gender division of labor, either across professions or within professions. But if you want to close the gender pay gap, or if you want to raise women's pay, what you want to do is get them into better jobs. You don't just need them to get a little bit more money in the job that they're in. So actually, I think if you just want to talk about negotiation and closing the gender wage gap, we could just focus on the role section primarily, and you'd probably make more progress than if we focus on getting people to ask for a little bit more where they are now. Also the work family, because obviously around huge things around wealth and departing work. Okay, so now I want to talk briefly about ambiguity, then I'm going to introduce this framework. So we think about ambiguity in terms of what is negotiable, how to go about negotiating, and then also who, in the sense of people are more likely to make, they're more likely to use stereotypes or heuristics if they don't know somebody. They draw inferences about how they'll behave, than if they know somebody. If they're more likely to use the information that they know about somebody than stereotypes, assuming they're not prejudiced. Obviously, prejudiced folks will do something different. So ambiguity about what is negotiable increases the potential for inequitable outcomes. Going back, so we go back to the relevance and salience of gender, right? Because if we're not really sure, we very often tend to compare ourselves and we tend to compare others to people like ourselves. So we may kind of non-consciously make assumptions about, what does that type of person usually do? What types of resources do we usually give that type of person? And so you'd have to think about where that would come out within, kidney cancer or your specific fields. But in like, say, corporate life or things like that, it can even be things like, who is going to travel for the overseas assignment? Who is going to take on that intensive leadership job? Who is going to be the line manager? There's just some kind of general assumptions that people just might subtly, their expectations might fill in these things. The other thing that's extremely important, particularly going back to that graphic the two trees, the tree dominated by the red birds versus the tree with a kind of diversity of birds. So when there's a lot of ambiguity, we will rely on our social networks to figure out how do you get that around here? What are the things you can possibly ask for? How do you solve these types of problems? How do you get that type of opportunity? And so if our networks also tend to be dominated by people like ourselves, right? And if we're in an environment, say, where men on average tend to be compensated better or tend to have more of particular types of opportunities as compared to women, or again, going back to a global corporation, I don't know if I've got my X and Y axis facing you guys. I have to make sure I go this way or not the other way. But if you're in a corporation where, Europeans and Americans, say, get different types of opportunities than do folks from emerging economies, which is actually quite extreme in terms of pay or like access to creative work versus technical work. But then you only go to people from your type, right? You might come back from getting advice from your closest advisors with different expectations than folks who are lower expectations than are folks from the dominant group, right? And so this is really important, that social networks, again, it's not discrimination, but it is how there can be gender biases or other identity-linked biases within your information search if this information is not clear, right? Okay. So ambiguity about how, I've kind of already talked about this, that it inhibits people from negotiating, because particularly those who feel like they might encounter resistance or they might encounter backlash, so they'll be more hesitant. Studies show if you make clear what the norms are with regard to how to pursue certain types of resources, the effects go away. I'm just like hesitating to tell you about one more study, but I actually think it's very interesting because it could apply for thinking about your students. So I've been doing more work lately, not just looking at gender, but thinking about other status-linked social characteristics that might influence some of these dynamics. And I have a colleague at Harvard Business School who studies time. And she did a bunch of studies showing that women were less likely than men to negotiate for extra time on things, for an extension in essence, even when it would enhance their productivity if they got the extra time. And honestly, people would rather, not honestly, like demonstrated in the study, people would rather that they produce something that's better than exactly on time, right? But the women were concerned that they were going to alienate people if they asked for extra time. So we've also been collecting data from folks who are, say, first-gen university students or something like that, people who feel like they're from, who not only feel like, but who are from lower say socioeconomic status or things like that, people from historically marginalized identities, they also feel like I can't ask for more time because people are not going to think I'm competent, right? So even though they would think you were more competent if you asked for the time and produced a better product, right? And so she's run a whole bunch of different studies for figuring out how do you do this. And if you just simply say to people, oh no, don't worry, you can ask for more time, it doesn't actually eliminate the women's concern that I'm going to undermine my relationships, or the student from the historically marginalized background's concern that you're going to think I'm not competent. Sure, you'll give it to me, but you're not going to like me as much. And so what she's tested is creating more like institutional mechanisms. So like for students, if you need an extension on your paper, submit the form here. So it depersonalizes it. It's more of a technical organizational solution that reduces ambiguity and then also reduces these identity factors by kind of taking them out, making it an institutional mechanism. I raise that because I think it might be an important kind of story to carry in mind as you think about how to create organizational interventions that open the doors for everybody to negotiate in ways that are going to enhance their productivity and motivation and career success. Okay, then finally, I've already covered this with regard to people are more likely, non-prejudiced, people are not like overtly discriminatory, are less likely to use stereotypes in their interactions with people if they know them, the more they know about them, right? So we're more likely to we might even do something that's not mean, but just like, oh good, it's a woman. Like I'm so glad because she's not like this woman, she'll be agreeable when we get in there and negotiate the package, So we might just sort of relax a little bit, not expect her to assert herself as much. This is going to be easier, So we have to think about we want to reduce ambiguity, both in terms of who are we interacting with so that we're really appealing to what their concerns are. But then also, if we think that somebody might make assumptions about what we're interested in or what we care about or our competencies, we want to make sure that that gets reduced. Okay, so this is the idea. We want to reduce, if we want to get into the space where these effects go away, we're going to think about context, and we're going to think about reducing the perceived relevance and salience of gender, and then ambiguity. So from an organizational perspective, reduce ambiguity. It's harder within organizations, certainly for quick fixes, to reduce a lot of these gendered norms that have been kind of established over time. But you can make relatively rapid interventions through this idea of reducing ambiguity, through creating more transparent systems within which people can operate, and that, in effect, again, as I've mentioned, that the effects tend to go away under those circumstances. You want to think about collecting data and assess it and addressing these things in negotiated outcomes. I do find working with organizations that the data collection systems aren't that great, to be completely honest, and they often don't have the skills to analyze the data. And so there are spaces where inequalities kind of crop up, where just people aren't paying attention. Like the managers are in charge of giving bonuses, and there's no real accountability. You're more likely to get inequalities where there are not strong systems. Okay, I'm going to skip over this and go to this framework. So we've already talked about this idea. If I'll run a group, particularly with young people, say, what do you think of when I say career negotiations? They say pay, job negotiations. But really, we're negotiating every day in our lives around the way work should get done, about how to manage work and life, and less often around pay. So it's really, but we also work with our life partners around how are we managing all of this, right? So much more influential in our lives are these informal negotiations than these kind of formal moments where we sit across from somebody in a very explicit way. We've already talked about thinking about pay, role, work, and family, not just pay. And so in this workbook that you'll see there are these 4 steps. Be sure, not to be too cute, but you'll see now where they come from. Okay, so one of the things I emphasize is start with your goals. And I would emphasize your goals. So very often society will tell you, or organizations, institutions will tell you what your goals should be. Or people get trapped by saying, oh, I've got this offer versus this offer. Like, this is the organization or whoever is suggesting this versus that. And you get caught up just comparing the two things that other people are giving you and not comparing them to what do you want to do? What are your aspirations? What are your goals? And then you want to think about understanding what you're negotiating for, which I'll explain in a moment, reducing ambiguity, and we now understand why that's so important, right? And then using this, enhancing your negotiations through relationships and your relationships through negotiation. So again, start with your goal, but think very broadly also, like for a woman in particular, if your lifetime goal is to have made a lot of money, then you probably need to do a lot of role and work-life negotiations in order to get there. So it's not just about pay. You have to kind of think about the whole package of all of your aspirations, caregiving and professional. Think about what do you want to achieve and how do you work those out, and how is what you're being offered compared to that? Because if there's a gap, that may be an opportunity for a conversation, a negotiation. So this is the space in the workbook. Okay, then I want to draw a distinction among 3 different types of negotiations because it's going to influence how you approach this. Asking negotiations are things that are standard. Sometimes I use the analogy of a vending machine. There are just certain things within organizational environments that are standard things that you can work out, you know? And people may or may not be entirely clear around ambiguity, what those things are. I did some work with emergency medicine professionals. We spent a lot of time talking about committee assignments and schedules. Like, those were 2 things where there were a lot of discussions. There's a lot of other stuff within medical science with regard to, I don't know, lab space, resources, all sorts of timing things, percentage clinical versus, you know, teaching or something, a whole variety of things that might need to get worked out, right? Now, bending negotiations, asking negotiations are standard. There's standard norms that you're like, not everybody gets the same thing, but we know that this is a conversation we should be having, and there are norms for deciding how it gets resolved. Bending is when you say, okay, I don't want exactly what's in the vending machine. I want something different, right? So you're asking for some sort of precedent breaking or, you know, special exception within the situation. Lots of evidence that this happens, particularly for high talent professionals. People want to retain them. But there's different arguments that you're going to make with somebody if you're asking for something standard than if you're asking for an exception, right? And when you're in a standard negotiation, it's very often you and just one other person because we know how to do this. The norms are already established. If you're in a negotiation for an exception, you've got to realize you may be only dealing with one other person, but that other person probably has to negotiate with other people in order to grant you an exception that could create precedence within the organization or perceptions of unfairness or something like that. So those are typically longer and multi-party negotiations. And then shaping negotiations are totally different. Shaping negotiations are not about like something that you necessarily want for yourself. They're about saying, I want to change the way we work around here. They're about stepping forward and saying, I think there could be more collaboration between departments. I think we could, you know, run the teaching program in a different way. You know, I think we could be introducing, you know, certain types of technologies. Whatever it is, you know, like you want to change the way you work. Those are inherently multi-party negotiations. Those are negotiations where you have to get a whole variety of stakeholders on board, and you've got to persuade them that your path forward is the best path for collective action as compared to the alternatives. And you may have multiple negotiations with different stakeholders who view your proposal differently because they've got different concerns about how it affects them. Their schedules, their constraints, their culture, whatever it is. Okay. So then this is a part of the workbook for thinking about, okay, what type of negotiation am I in? Again, though, going backward or going through the thing, you may not realize, like, I don't know, is this standard or is this exceptional? Wait a minute, like, I want to change this, but actually I realize I want to change the whole place. You know, I don't want to just change the way my schedule works. I think everybody's schedule should work differently. We need to just change the way we do things around here. So you need to think about what type of negotiation situation are you in? And we've already talked about this in depth, why this is so important to reduce ambiguity. The other thing is people often think about negotiations, and I should have mentioned this when I talked about thinking about your goals. If you, sometimes when I'm running these things, people will say, well, I don't have a negotiation right now. But what I will ask them to do is back up and say, well, what are your goals farther out there? There are very few ambitious goals that can be achieved just working on your own. I mean, even if your goal is, I want to run the marathon. Most of us, we are entangled in relationships, we've got work, I mean, even just negotiating to figuring out the time to run enough miles, right? The time negotiation to run enough miles to run the marathon is in itself. I mean, you're going to end up having to work with other people to achieve that goal. Most of our goals are more complex at this stage of life. And so what you want to do is think about what is your goal, and then what is the problem solving that I would have to do along that path in order to achieve that goal? And you're likely to find that it involves a lot of different types of negotiations, whether asking, bending, or shaping. And there's very often a lot of reduced ambiguity around, well, I need to just start thinking forward and figuring out what is that, just figuring out the path toward that higher level goal. Okay, so this is the R section, and then this is my last part here, which is this little ditty that we have, enhance your negotiations through relationships and your relationships through negotiation. So enhance your negotiations through relationships. This is about thinking about your social network, right? So who in your network might be able to provide you information, advice, social support, advocacy. As we've already discussed in the sections on like the demography of the work area and about ambiguity, you want to think about not only your convenience network, but you want to think about what are the relationships that I have that can give me the best perspective on how I would achieve my goals, right? On what I might be able to work out in order to achieve my goals, how I should go about doing that, right? Who are those people I need to work with? What do they care about? What do they understand about me, my aspirations, my problem-solving style, why my arguments are useful to them. In terms of social support, encouragement is really important, obviously. It's also, we find time and again, really valuable to have someone you trust enough to let them tell you that you're off base. So there are a lot of, like, when people start preparing for negotiations, they're often in a very kind of egocentric space. It's normal, like particularly when you've got a lot of fire in the belly about something, and you like maybe even if you feel like this is unfair, we might go in with an argument that's just really focused on us and why we see it this way. And it's very helpful to talk these things through with somebody else with whom you have a good enough relationship that they can say to you, you are only looking at this from your side. Like, why would that be persuasive to others, right? And then advocacy, sometimes it is better for somebody else to toot our horn than ourselves, obviously, right? But also, and particularly in these shaping negotiations, it's very important as you're thinking, if you really want to make change, you are likely to want to go around and get a bunch of people bought in to what you are proposing, so that when you finally step forward in any sort of formal way and propose that you pursue this, there are a lot of people who already understand why this idea that you have would make sense to them, right? Okay, so that's the E. That's the first part of the E. It's my last part. So this part here of enhance your relationships through negotiation is based on our research on how do you negotiate in a way that reduces that resistance, reduces the social backlash, reduces that, sure, I'll give her what she wants, but I don't want to work with her. How do we get past that? And so what we found running when we first ran these experiments, we thought, well, if you have a legitimate external standard for what you're asking for, that should really do it. But it didn't. What we found is that you want to do two things. One is explain why it is legitimate from their perspective. I often use the example of glasses, like from their perspective. Why is what you're asking for legitimate, not just to you? You should pay me more because I work really hard. You've got to think about it from their perspective. But then also that signaling that you're taking their interests into account. That you're taking on their perspective as well as your own. And what we found, number one, this is just good negotiating advice, but what we found in numerous studies is that this not only made people more persuasive, but it reduced that potential for that resistance that we were encountering. So if you're asking, you want to do this by, as we've already discussed, pointing to past precedent. If you're bending, you want to explain why an exception in this case is appropriate. And if you're shaping, it's about the strategic vision for the group. So you'll have all of this stuff in the workbook. I'm just going to flip ahead here. to have these QR codes. So if you're interested in these materials, there's a page for educators. It's got a whole bunch of teaching resources, and then the page for negotiators. It's got this workbook, and it's got some videos and a variety of other resources. And if you're interested in, for younger people from historically marginalized background, we have a new podcast on there where we had worked with them, and then we tracked how they use these materials. So I'll pause there. Questions or comments?
Really.
Questions or comments? Thank you.
Please go ahead and use the microphones in the room.
Yeah. Maybe
This is not as bad. At the Kennedy School, we have a giant forum where you have to stand up and...
I can get us started.
Get started.
You know, every time there seems to be this implicit bias or inherent feeling when a woman is applying for a job about, oh my God, she's going to get pregnant, have kids, and it is going to impact her productivity. I mean, it's maybe unsaid. At times it is actually clearly said even. Do you meet that head on in your negotiation? How do you sort of work around it?
Yeah, I mean, that's very, that's something where I'd probably look to try to address it first at an organizational level rather than just at an individual level. But I'm going to go sideways a little bit first,
Okay.
and then I'm going to come back to this example. So we've been doing some work with Muslim women in India, talk about a marginalized group.
Mm-hmm.
And we developed case studies on negotiation that would be relevant to their lives. And the example that they wanted to talk about was, how do you get access to an apartment that's anywhere near where you work? Because there's so much discrimination against Muslims in general, but then also like a woman living alone or something like that in an apartment. And so what the case is all about is basically like how to negotiate past the discrimination. So it's very complex. They love it, but teaching it, you feel a little bit like, oof, you know, what could I be asking? Like, am I asking someone to do? So they say things like, starting off by saying, you know, do you allow non-vegetarians, you know, in your apartment house, which is a signal like, you know, you would allow a Muslim. So I think that, like that case, that's a lot about not so much do you discriminate against Muslims, you know. It's a lot of asking questions and then figuring out how do you signal. So in this case, one of the things that the woman does is persuade her mother to come live with her along with her brother in the apartment. And then she hires the same housekeeper as the landlord, so that the housekeeper will snoop around her house and report back to the landlord that the house is very neat and very calm and that they're like good citizens. So I'm not, but I think I would tend to, if you're worried about that as a fellow or something like that, or a young doctor, I would want to ask a lot of questions to figure out how these types of things get managed within the organization, right? And then I might want to find ways of signaling to that person, not necessarily directly, but by example or by references or things like that, that don't put me in this type, don't put me in this category that you're putting me in, right? Because I do think if you think in ambiguity people are going to do that, then now again, I would feel more confident about an ability of a group of women within a practice or an organization to start changing norms about that. I also think that making access to there's actually, I have to watch out because I could go on and on and on about this, but okay. there are norms in how these things are addressed. You can put one story that I actually heard was a pediatric practice. It's actually I think there's an article written up of it that I'd be happy to share. Where they had a committee where they were admitting fellows or doctoral students, I guess, in pediatrics. And the guy took over the department, and he wasn't really thinking about gender equality because their numbers looked pretty good. It kind of looked like typically, 65, 35. But he just thought it would be more equitable to always have a male interviewer and a female, or a man and a woman review the applications. And when they did that, all of a sudden, the finalists were 50-50 male-female. And then they had the women come and be interviewed, both by men and by women, and all of a sudden they flipped it. So it was more like 60-40 female than male. And what they were doing is they weren't intentionally trying to do this, but they were draining some of the biases from the system by having a divergent perspectives. There are also changes in policies that you can do. There's been a lot of innovation actually within the medical sector of managing greedy work by working in partnerships like practices rather than individual performers. So there are a lot of things that you can do about that. But again, reducing the relevance, the perceived relevance and salience of gender with regard to those questions, and reducing ambiguity about how those types of things get managed is really, really important.
No, that's great advice.
Thank you.
Dan?
Yes, hi, thanks, wonderful talk. I'm curious, in our culture, at least where I work, the collective seems to be a better priority system than the individual, and yet it seems like a lot of our kind of tenure structures and promotion structures are kind of really centered on the individual. And so I guess rather than trying to get women to be more individual, I'm thinking, how do we get more of the men and male-oriented people to be more collective? Is there a way to change that, to kind of change the culture towards what I think is maybe a better overall work culture?
Yeah, so I'm like revealing how my brain works very laterally, but can I give you another like sort of lateral example and go back? But like one of the things that at Harvard in the professional schools, we have the case method, and you speak up and you raise your hand, and that rewards extroverts and people from individualistic cultures and people who are native English speakers. None of which are necessarily correlated with the people who are most prepared to contribute to the class, right? And so what we might be saying is like, are our evaluation systems or our paths correlated with our actual values, right? So if our organizational values are very collective, yet our performance advancement systems are star-oriented and don't seem to reward collective contributions, then I would go back to saying, okay, what are those values, and do we have blind spots within our systems with regard to whether we're capturing all of our values? And I think there's one example I know at Harvard Medical School, this is some time ago, but was the explicit decision to have not only research and clinical tracks, but also teaching tracks, which was a space where people were giving enormously to the institution, and the fact that people can get promoted on that basis was a way of integrating some of those teaching hospital institutions into the career advancement track. That may be a kind of naive and obvious example, but yes, I think that's a great example. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then ambiguity, reducing ambiguity. Are we clear about this? Do we just sort of recognize a star, or do we run our candidates through a whole bunch of criteria that reflect things that we value?
And I guess I'm thinking, how do we get our stars to value the collective?
Yeah.
They can lead by example.
Right, and that's also, that's a leadership. That is, so if you think about what is the relevance and salience of gender within a context, it's basically social norms, right? So what are our assumptions? Like, do we always tell a story that is, I don't want to pick up, there are lots of, but like a masculine heroic narrative, of who do we celebrate? Another example is who is on our walls. At Harvard, we are mostly white men on our hallways and our walls. We have been, in the last 10 years, kind of working on that. But who are our heroes? What are the stories that we tell? Those are actually very important things for influencing the degree to which we take these kind of gendered norms, implicit very often, but these norms that assume, what does success look like? What do we value as an institution? What is our model of the ideal worker? There's a lot of literature within the business scholars looking on the ideal worker. And the ideal worker is often this kind of masculine stereotypic ideal that is inconsistent, for instance, with work and family, who is just heroically, entirely dedicated to either individual performance or to the collective. And what are the stories that we tell to identify those things?
Wow.
If I'm not running out of time, I'll give you one other example, which is heroism. How do we recognize heroism? And what we tend, a lot of the awards for heroism tend to be characterized by male, gender, sex-related characteristics, like the physical thrust to jump into a dangerous situation, right? So people who run to the fire. But if you look at other types of heroism, like the propensity to protect Jews from Nazi Germany, or the propensity to be a live kidney donor, you actually find more women engaged in those types of heroism than do men, whereas you see more men getting that, energetic burst to run whatever toward the drowning person. And so if we have to develop our visions of heroism that are inclusive so that we don't just associate it with one type.
Hi, I had a quick question about, as a woman, do you think negotiating, irrespective of whether you're doing it for pay or a role in the institution, would be different if you're talking to a man versus a woman?
I am so glad you asked that. So generally, actually, no. So, which is interesting. I mean, in terms of the resistance, like the data on the backlash or encountering resistance, we all live in this environment where we have these implicit associations. And so what we find is, and this is not only in the negotiation realm, but across a lot of realms, we don't typically get gender of evaluator effects. We don't typically get this sort of battle of the sexes. It's not really that men, now in some spaces that are very patriarchal, like cultures where there are laws that women can't, there are very explicitly discriminatory parts of the world. But in our world, you really don't tend to get that as much. In fact, if anything, so I'll tell you examples. So yes, sometimes, particularly if men are in the dominant group and you're not from that dominant group, then you may end up getting a little more flack from the men just because they don't understand your type. You're acting differently than I'm used to, and that isn't the way we do it around here, But women can also hold women to higher standards. So if you want to get gender effects, another way to do it is you put men all together with men and you put women all together with women, and that same-sex environments activates these gendered norms. And so women can, in those domains, when it's all women, they can expect all the other women to be really nice, and we're all being fair, Why are you self-asserting? What are you asking for? You know what I mean? We're all, And so we have to be careful, actually, that we don't also, do that to ourselves. Another area another situation that can undermine relationships among women is when there's only token female representation at the highest ranks. And because what it signals is that the women are going to compete for a very scarce pie to advance it all, and also that their gender is a liability. So interestingly, there are a number of women, we get a lot of military folks through the Kennedy School, and the women will experience this sort of psychological feeling of, I've always distanced myself from other women. I just stay away from them. I try to be I'm not like one of them. I'm not like the failure story of women in the military. I'm something different. Mm-hmm. And then this one woman told me this story. It's I came here and it's a really different environment. And I'm captain of the women's hockey team. And I am so excited about organizing for women. But it's the environment that you're in of what does that identity signal to you? But that goes back to also the narratives, Is this a place in which women thrive and win? Or is this a place in which we don't hear that story as much?
Right. Thank you. No, this was wonderful. In the interest of time, I think, there are a number of people to thank for starting and organizing this session. Thank you to our speaker, of course, but, I definitely want to thank our sponsors, both Pfizer and Exelixis, for supporting this event, as well as KCA, who really came through and took it on to develop this Women in RCC initiative, make so much out of it. When we started, we were just an idea to give women a platform to do grand rounds, and frankly, they have just taken it and developed it tremendously. So huge thanks to all the KCA organizers to be able to allow us to do this and build on it. So in terms of building, the announcements that I want to make is please consider applying. We are actually going to be starting a leadership course through KCA that will be 6 months of multiple sessions where you will get leadership training. So those applications will be sent to you, will be on the website fairly soon. It's not a big application. It's going to be, Tian was very specific about not adding to work, so please try to apply for that if you're interested, and we would love to work with you going forward. And just having this team will be amazing, and we'll keep building on it. Please tell your friends, colleagues, whoever would like to come. And I want to especially recognize our allies, the men who attended and contributed to this program, which is really remarkable.
Yeah, so if I could add to that.
Yeah.
You know, this program really came out of seed conversations that we've had in a series of women in RCC breakfasts through IKCS Europe. So we hope that by having Professor Bowles here, we've really given you the science of negotiation and thought-provoking. It certainly prompted a lot of thinking on my part on how do we advocate for our women in the academic medicine, and I hope that you take those skill sets home with you as well. So to add to the leadership coaching opportunity that we're running within Women in RCC within KCA, it's a group called Wellbeing Works. We actually had several applications and coaching groups that we interviewed, and the group called Wellbeing Works is led by 2 women physicians who have made leadership coaching for academic physicians their sort of life work. And so they're very passionate about it, and I think they will bring a really wonderful series of coaching sessions. And so for those in the room who are at early career, mid-career stages, we do hope that you'll apply, and we think it will be a group of 15 or so people who engage sort of in this monthly series. And then if it's successful, we hope to recreate that every 6-month increments. And so I do think that through our discussions and interactions, we are hoping to provide these tangible solutions and hoping that you all get a lot out of it as well.
Yeah, and definitely stay tuned for more programs. Early 2024, we will again start the year potentially with more of these kind of programs. We welcome feedback from you. You know, we definitely have some ideas, but collectively, please help us make this better and better and more to meet your needs. Thank you.